Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar hosted by eHealth Space and sponsored by Orion Health. My name is Josh Glidden. I'm a journalist with eHealthSpace.org and I have a background in science, technology and healthcare journalism. I've spent a lot of time reporting on some of the issues we're going to discuss this morning. Of course, I'm your host and I'll be looking after this webinar and making sure everything runs smoothly. I have the control panel here and I'd like to encourage your questions. As you can see, there's a question tab on your own control panel, so if you write your questions there as we go along, I'll see them and we can get to those at the end. Just briefly on eHealthSpace.org, we're an independent media site for health professionals and all those that support care delivery. We are passionate about the transformation of healthcare through talented people and the use of technology. We've designed these webinars with that in mind, and so it's great to see you all in the room for this special presentation. I'll introduce our speakers shortly, and the recording of this webinar will be available on eHealthSpace.org in the next couple of days. You can review it and share it with your colleagues at your leisure. Today we'll be hearing from Dr. David Hay, Product Strategist at Orion Health. Dr. Hay will give us an overview of Orion Health's involvement in health information sharing and will provide a comprehensive view of FHIR. Dr. Hay will then introduce Graham Grieve, FHIR Project Lead at Health Intersections, for his part of the presentation and his views on FHIR. Finally, we'll hear from David Leach, who is Senior Vice President for Intelligent Integration at Orion Health. As I mentioned before, at the end of the presentation, we have time for questions, and you can type your questions into the control panel as we go along. Our presenters will do their best to answer all the questions that come through in the time we have left. Again, thanks for joining us. And on that note, I'd like to introduce Orion Health's Dr. David Hay. Dr. Hay, thank you for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you, Josh. And thank you, everybody who's tuned into this webinar. I suspect that many of you will know me, but for those who don't, I do have a medical degree, but I've been involved in health IT for quite a number of decades now, to the point where I'd be quite unsafe, I think, in delivering clinical care. I've been involved in FHIR pretty much from the beginning. About 3 years ago, I first saw it at a working group meeting, and I realized its potential and interoperability, and I've really been quite a passionate advocate ever since. I'm also quite involved in HL7, and I'm the chair of HL7 New Zealand. I sit on the FHIR management group, which helps to draft the FHIR specification. And I'm also a blogger. I blog on FHIR implementation issues at FHIRblog.com. Next slide, please. Next slide, Josh. Okay, so FHIR unlocking innovation. What would be an elevator speech for FHIR? Well, we think of FHIR as an evolving next generation HL7 interoperability standard. So it's very much focused on decreasing the cost of interoperability and unlocking the innovation that can be made in healthcare. Now, I talked about it being evolving. So currently FHIR is at what we call a draft status, DSTU status, but more and more we're thinking of it as being a working standard. It's very much at a stage now where it is sufficiently mature for people to use, but it is still at a point where it is evolving and changing. In fact, it's actually at the sweet spot for people to start to become involved in it. FHIR has been very much designed with implementers in mind. When we're making changes to the specification, we always ask ourselves, is this going to make an implementer's job easier or harder? And it needs to be easier to make it into the specification. That's not to say it's not based on a very robust methodology and models. It's just that those models are hidden from the implementer. They don't need to understand them in order to be able to implement FHIR. And FHIR is very well supported in the vendor community. In fact, it's fair to say we were quite taken by surprise as to the amount of interest that has actually occurred. This is both a good thing and a bad thing. It's great to have the interest, but it certainly pushes a fair bit of pressure onto the development team. Next slide, please, Josh. So a question has to be asked, why FHIR? Why did FHIR come about? In 2011, the board of HL7 noted a number of points. They noted that the interoperability requirements are increasing. We were seeing an increase in the need for collaborative care and the care coordination that occurs as a part of that, changing payment models which required more information than was previously required, an aging population, decision support. All of these things meant that the need to share data was becoming more and more prevalent. Involving the patient raised the bar because, you know, we had to make sure that the information was at a sort of state where a patient could actually understand it and contribute to it. They noticed that there was a need for real-time access, which hadn't previously been the case. The incredible increase in advance in mobile technology meant that many of the standards simply weren't keeping up. There's a vast increase in the amount and the type and the source of data. We're seeing data from devices. We're seeing data from genetics. We're thinking in terms of precise medicine now, where medicine is tailored to the individual patient. So all of these things involve an increasing amount of data. The need of analytics, population health, again, was increasing. And finally, implementer expectations. And by that, what we mean is that implementers sort of expect a modern standard. They expect something that works the way they work, rather than something which requires them to change. So the board looked at these things and they realized that the existing standards were lacking. And so a fresh look was required. Next slide, please. So let's take a helicopter view of FHIR. So FHIR stands for Fast Healthcare Interoperability Resources, FHIR. And indeed, there are a couple of things in that name that are worth calling out. Fast. We like to believe that we can deploy solutions as rapidly as we can, both deploy and design solutions. Now, this is health. Health is never straightforward. It's never going to be easy. We do the best we can. FHIR supplies well-supported, well-thought-out, standardized APIs. And by standardized, we mean the APIs that are used elsewhere in other industries, using RESTful technologies. These are the same APIs that the Googles, the Facebooks, the Amazons are using. FHIR consists of simple-to-use resources, where a resource is a thing of interest in healthcare. We'll talk a little bit more about resources in just a moment, but this is something like a medication, like an observation, like a patient. It's the smallest sort of thing that you might want to share. And the advantage of that is that you don't need a lot of domain knowledge to actually develop a FHIR-based solution. And then we have controlled extensibility. So there's a pattern here in FHIR where we keep the resources as concise as possible, as small as possible. At one point we had a concept called the 80%, where something only made it into the core if it was being used by 80% of implementations. We've relaxed a bit since then, but the whole point is to have a standard that can be extended to meet an individual's needs in a way that's both discoverable and it's safe to use. Familiar tools and technologies for implementers. We've touched on this before. Implementers now expect to be able to use the tooling that they are familiar with. And so FHIR is very much supportive of those desires. And so it improves the healthcare exchange by providing these APIs and these implementers. And as I've said before, we've had enormous endorsement and support from both vendors, but also from the regulatory committees. And indeed, in the United States, we've had a project called Project Argonaut that many of you may have thought of. This is where the vendors themselves, recognizing the value of FHIR, have put significant resources into FHIR in order to help move the standard along. Next slide, please, Josh. We can't possibly give a presentation on FHIR without a pun of some sort, so therefore, sparking application innovation. How would that work? Well, by providing predictable interfaces, and by predictable we mean both in the transport, the way that the resources are moved around, and in the content, means that an application developer can be confident that their application can work on multiple systems. The use of industry standard technologies such as REST and JSON further make that job easier. The ability to discover services through conformance statements and resources. And by this, what we mean is it's possible to electronically determine what a particular server can actually support. And it's possible to tailor your solution to that degree of support. And then we have other standards that are being built in the space. There's a standard called SMART, built by a very clever chap called Josh Mandel out of Boston Children's Hospital, that takes the FHIR resources, adds security in the form of OAuth 2, and has built a specification that allows small applications to be built against EMR systems. And this developed enormous interests. So taking all of those things, what we find is that we get a lower cost of entry. It's now far easier for a vendor who has a good idea for something to actually enter this market, whereas previously it was extremely difficult. There's improved access to data. By providing standardized interfaces and by making it straightforward for applications to access those data, This improves the ability to provide innovative solutions. So all of this increases the commercial viability of applications that are developed with FHIR-based interfaces, and means that you can write an application that you can be confident is going to be able to work on multiple different systems. Next slide, please, Josh. So let's move sideways just a little wee bit. And let's think about what the benefits of a FHIR-based solution would be to clinicians and to patients. Next slide, please, Josh. So let's think first about clinicians. What's in it for a clinician? So the first part is having improved access to a more complete, higher quality patient information. And we're seeing this both in terms of the information that we currently access, such as lab data and observations and interventions and such like, but we're also seeing it in the more advanced fields such as genomics. And I just touched on this one just a little bit before. Genomics in particular is a really exciting part of FHIR. There's a work group which is developing FHIR resources specifically to represent genomic information. This offers the possibility of being able to share genomic information much easier than we can right now. FHIR makes it easier for clinicians to actually organise investigations and to provide management by providing standardised ways of actually providing the orders, by being able to make their workflow more standardised, by being able to represent the data that's needed as part of those investigations. This all makes it more simple for them to do what they need to do to help support the patient. We'll see a greater choice in a variety of applications that support clinical workflow, where at the moment we have a relatively small number of very large systems. By using FHIR, by using SMART, we're going to see the ability to have small targeted applications for targeted purposes. One of the comments that Graham made recently at the Dev Days was how he feels that we're moving on to clinical interoperability rather than semantic interoperability. In other words, the ability to share information seamlessly and for clinicians to potentially change the way in which they actually manage their workflow. This will be facilitated by FHIR. The fact that it's more straightforward to develop systems means that IT development can be improved, means that business problems can be solved that much faster. And all of these things are going to save time for clinicians. And by saving time for clinicians, that's going to give more time to be able to spend with the patient in terms of the delivery of care. Next slide, please. And what about the patient? Well, what we're going to see for the patient, what we're starting to see already, is the development of applications targeted at the patient and helping them to engage with their clinical care providers. Now, there are many of these applications already available. If you go into the iTunes store, there are many thousands of them. But by and large, these applications can only access information that's sort of entered through that application. They can't access information that's outside of it. What FHIR does is removes the technical barriers to that sharing of data. It removes the technical barriers to being able to fully participate in the healthcare ecosystem. Now, that's not to say that there aren't issues with privacy and security. Of course there are, but the technical barriers are removed. And also benefiting the patient is in fact the fact that the clinician has access to more data, has a more complete record. So that allows the clinician to make better decisions, to be more efficient at their diagnosis, to provide a higher quality of care. And all of these things, in the same way as they benefited the clinician, also benefited the patient in terms of not wasting their time, of making their journey through the healthcare system much more efficient and as enjoyable as a journey through healthcare can be, as enjoyable. So next slide, please, Josh. What about benefits to implementers and healthcare organisations? What's in it for those guys? Next slide. So implementers benefit by being able to use familiar tooling and technologies in their solutions. By using these standards such as XML and JSON is a first-class citizen in the space, HTTP, REST, security standards such as SSL and OAuth. This makes it just that much easier for implementers to become involved. And we've actually seen this at Connectathons. We've actually seen situations where vendors have come into a Connectathon and within the space, literally of 24 hours, have been able to develop solutions, often mobile solutions, against RESTful services and RESTful interfaces. Again, of value to implementers is the predefined resources and the predefined APIs. So what this means is that instead of having to figure out how to represent information and how to actually exchange it with someone else, all of these things are done for you, and they are done well. They are done by a community that is expert in this field. And that means that what an implementer can do is focus on the value add, on the business proposition which they supply, rather than having to worry too much about the technical infrastructure. And it also avoids all the various, dare I say, arguments that can occur at the development level when there are different ways of doing something. By standardizing that, by saying this is the way that you do it, you focus your attention on where the value is. FHIR has got extensive documentation. It's fully hyperlinked and online. It's the first healthcare standards I've ever come across that did that. There are samples. Pretty much every resource has got samples. We are aiming, in fact, in FHIR to have an example that covers every single part of every resource. And there are also reference server implementations. It's possible to actually develop an application today and test it out against a server which is fully compliant with the FHIR specification. Again, of benefit to an implementer is the access to help and assistance when required. There is a very active and a very supportive community that's available through channels such as Skype, through email, through list servers and so forth. And it's quite possible to get answers to questions literally within seconds. I've had answers to a question within 10 to 20 seconds of asking it. And because FHIR is a truly international standard, generally there's someone somewhere around the world who's awake and just looking at the Skype chat to see if there's anything interesting passing through. There are open source libraries that are available. Here in Orion we are using one of those, and I'm sure many of them actually do. What they do is they help take away some of the more complex parts of interfacing with an application. They're available for Java, for .NET. We've seen them in the iOS space. And again, these are libraries made freely available to make an implementer's job easier. And finally, from a implementer's perspective, FHIR is very mobile friendly. And these days, any solution really has to start with mobile and move on from there. If you're mobile, FHIR is almost the only game in town. Next slide, please, Josh. And if you're a healthcare organisation, if you're a hospital, if you're a PHO in New Zealand anyway, what's in it for you? Why does FHIR have value? Well, the fact that most vendors are already committed to FHIR has got great value because it increases your range of applications that you can look to deploy. And so what we should see is we should see faster deployments, again because it's relatively straightforward for implementers to develop their solutions. We should see lower cost interoperability. And although this may seem odd coming from a representative of a vendor, it reduces vendor lock-in. Because as FHIR is implemented by more and more source systems, then the ability to swap out a non-performing solution is made that much easier. And this is going to mean that vendors will continue to lift their game in terms of providing value to end users. And then the last bullet point there is really about internal application development. Many healthcare organizations will actually have teams that develop software specifically for their needs. Currently, that data, those applications can only, with difficulty, access the data held within the big EMR systems. By opening that up and by making it available through FHIR interfaces, it's going to make it that much more straightforward, that much easier to develop specific purpose-built applications, but which nevertheless can communicate with the data held securely in the main repositories of information. So it provides consistent interfaces, which are really critical for this plug and play. Next slide, please, Josh. So all is not rosy. FHIR is, I believe, really important, but it does have its challenges. Mapping from existing data sources to FHIR can be very tricky. When they haven't been captured in a way that's been intended to be shared, it can be a fair bit of work in trying to get FHIR talking to your back-end systems. We still need to think about security. FHIR provides hooks for security, but it is in and of itself not a security system, and so we use external standards such as SSL and OAuth and such like for that. Privacy is another aspect which needs to be thought through. And this is a complex sector that we live in. Getting alignment between the different parts of the sector isn't something which FHIR is going to do in and of itself. People have to actually see what the possibilities are and be prepared to alter their workflow to take advantage of these new possibilities. Next slide, please. So let's have a little look at the technology. Let's look at what underlies this. Next slide, please, Josh. I've touched on resources a number of times here, and indeed resources is part of the name of FHIR. So here we have a set of some of the resources that exist in FHIR. This is just a small part of them. There's around about, I think, about 79 so far. We're anticipating somewhere between 100 to 150 all up by the time that we've done. And a resource is the smallest thing that kind of makes sense to exchange. So as you can see from the screen there, it's an allergy, it's a procedure, it's a goal. So each of these is a resource in and of itself. And in showing you the slide, there's a couple of points that I would like to call out. The first is that when you look at a resource, it's pretty obvious what it actually does. So when you see a resource which has the name of procedure, you can be pretty sure it's dealing about a procedure. If you see one that says immunization, the same thing. So it's very self-explanatory what a resource does. And the contra to that is that if you're looking for a resource to do something, it's reasonably straightforward to have a look at the list and find the one that best suits your needs. And of course, you can always use the community to help you in deciding that. Next slide, please, Josh. So here is an example of a resource. It is a patient resource, and you can tell that because it actually has the word patient in the name. And this slide shows the 4 parts of a resource. I do hope that is actually showing on the screen because I'm still seeing, thank you, that's fine. Okay, so here we have the patient resource, and it shows the 4 main parts of a resource in those 4 different colors there. The first part at the top with the green background is the metadata about the resource. It's the identity. It's when it was last updated. The next part there is the text. Now this is what we call the lesson of CDA. All FHIR resources have got the ability to have a human readable summary as part of the resource. Because what we found is that if you can exchange information that people can understand, even if you can't code it all, you're at least making a step along the interoperability journey. So that's the text element in the resource. Next up there is the extension. I'm not going to have anywhere near as much time as I would like to talk about extensions. The main part I would like to call out here is that if you look at that extension, you will see that it has a URL. And what that is doing is that is pointing to the definition of that extension. And this is what we mean by managed extensions. Every extension in FHIR has a pointer to its definition. So if you receive an extension you don't understand, you can easily go away and find out what it means. This is in direct contrast to what some other standards are like. And then finally at the bottom there we see the coded data. We see the identifier, we see the name, we see the gender and so forth. So this varies from resource to resource, but the key part being that it's pretty obvious what each element actually is and what it means. And for the geeks amongst you, this is an XML, but of course JSON is a first-class citizen in FHIR. Next slide please, Josh. So resources are a key part of FHIR, but in and of themselves they're just the small building blocks. What we really need is we need for resources to be able to refer to each other. And this is an example of this happening. So here we have a procedure resource. And that procedure resource has as its subject the patient resource. And then down on the bottom right, it has as its performer a practitioner resource. So what you see here is how we take the individual resources, we have them reference other resources, and we can build up a web, we can build up a graph of information that can be used to tell any clinical story. Next slide, please, Josh. And to show how this could actually be made to work, here we have a consultation. It's a standard consultation about a 12-year-old boy who attends with ear pain. He has an elevated temperature. On examination, he's diagnosed with otitis media, and he's given a prescription for amoxicillin. And then 2 days later, he comes back with a rash, and a diagnosis of allergy to penicillin is made, and the antibiotic is changed to erythromycin. So a fairly simple clinical story. How do we represent that in FHIR? Well, what you'll see in this in the text is the coloured parts and the coloured words have got a direct reference to the actual resources which are over there on the right-hand side. So we can see that the patient, and that was supposed to be a brown colour, is a patient resource. Pain in the right ear is a condition, elevated temperature is an observation, and so forth. So what we're saying here is that each part of the consultation can be directly mapped to a FHIR resource that can represent that part. So that's half the story. Those are the bits. How do they connect together? Next slide, please, Josh. So here we now have a web of resources. This is exactly those same resources, except this time I've drawn the actual relations between the different resources. We see that there we are. So pain in the right ear has got an asserter, being the patient. It was performed by the patient. And here, for example, we see the ability to be able to tell who has actually said that this thing is true. Now, I haven't shown all of the references there. This is just to show you how it all works. But you can see how the bits hang together. And hopefully what you can also see is that because we are linking the parts of the story together, it's a lot more feasible to do analytics on this than it would be without. If you wanted to know how many times amoxicillin had been prescribed for otitis media, you could do so. If you wanted to know what the average elevated temperature was for that diagnosis, you can do so. All of the links are there to enable you to do some very sophisticated analysis. And of course, this data has been collected as part of the clinical story. It's not been captured separately. And for this sort of thing to work, we really need to be able to make it as simple as possible to capture the data and not require our clinicians to do extra work to do so. But wait, it gets better. Next slide, please, Josh. So as we've mentioned a number of times in this talk, FHIR is all about interoperability. FHIR is all about telling somebody else what you found and what you want them to do. It's all about exchanging and sharing information. And to do that, we need to take the information that we've collected and we need to package it up in some way in order to give it to somebody else. Well, prior to FHIR, that's not that straightforward to do, because what you needed to do is you needed to go into your system, you needed to pick out the bits that you wanted to share, you needed to put them into some kind of structure to share it, you needed to map between the way you recorded it and the way that you wanted to represent it on the wire. FHIR, that's all different. FHIR, what we do is we take the exact same resources and we package them up into a single bundle, and we place, in this case, a composition resource because we're dealing with a document which has got things like the author and the date and that kind of stuff, and that becomes our sharing artifact. I haven't shown all the resources in here, sorry, all the references in here again, because it will just make the picture look very confusing. But the key part I'd really want to get across is just how straightforward it is to pick up the information from inside your EMR, to package it in a way that it can be easily shared with somebody else, and indeed at the other end, for the recipient to be able to pull that information out of the package and incorporate it into their own system if they need to do so. So this has huge benefits in terms of both quality of data exchange, speed of data exchange, and the ability to preserve those links and those references so important for analytics. Next slide, please, Josh. Profiling. We've touched on profiling, and there's no way I can talk about it to the degree that it deserves. Profiling recognises the fact that we have different contexts in healthcare. We might be a GP, we might be a hospital doctor, we could be a specialist. We have different needs to record information, but we want to use the same resources. Because if we're wanting to reference, say, a condition, we want to use the same resource. We had lots of different resources that meant the same thing. Interoperability would take a nosedive. So we need a way to be able to describe how we are using FHIR. And we want those usage statements to be able to be structured in a codified way that a computer can look at. They can be published so that they can be found by other people. And we want to be able to use these structures as a basis for validating messages, for code generation, for UI generation, and so forth. And there's two main aspects to profiling. One is the part of where you take a resource and you say, here are the bits that are of interest to me. And then you can also add new extensions to it. So profiling adapts FHIR for specific scenarios. Next slide, please, Josh. So here we have an example of a patient resource. and what we've done is we've said, well, you know, the standard number of names in a FHIR resource can be 0 to many. We want there to be one and only one. Across the right-hand side there, we might say that the identifier uses the Medicare number, and it's required. We might want to say that the gender codes that we're going to use in patients are a different set of gender codes. They're the one used in Australia or New Zealand rather than the one used in America. We might be able to want to say that we don't support a photo. It's in there, but our system doesn't support that. And then finally, we want to be able to add an extension to indicate what Aboriginal tribe this patient is part of, if that is appropriate. So this is what profiling does. This is taking the base resources and adapting them for our own needs. Next slide, please, Josh. So in summary, or almost in summary, FHIR is at a point now where it is sufficiently mature to be really useful, yet not so tied down that it can't be changed. We're now at the stage where we really need to get clinicians and patients to more fully participate in the development of FHIR. If we truly wish to get sort of medical interoperability, we need the people who are affected by this to be part of this. So you're on the next slide. As part of that, we've been developing tooling which is specific and intended for clinical folk, called FHIR. You can find it on the web by Googling if you like. And so it's designed to be able to allow a clinician to build their own resource by selecting from a list. And you see an example here of a condition, and you can see the resource which is being built up. It's an educational tool. And indeed, this will work against a profile. So it would be possible for a clinician to actually create a profile and then see what it actually looks like. Next slide, please, Josh. And here is an example of how we actually create a profile. Again, I don't want to go into the details of this. If you are interested, it's available on the web. We're very happy to for you to have a look at it. I do need to point out that the FHIR project is providing very sophisticated and very complete tools for doing this for the lower level developers. FHIR is really intended as a training tool than anything else. But I would encourage people to go out and have a look and see what they think. Next slide, please, Josh. So in summary, FHIR is the latest HL7 interoperability standard. It is at a stage at the moment where it is available to be used and is being used, as we will hear shortly. There is enormous interest in it both locally and internationally. And I think this third one is the key one, and the one that most excites me, is that it's at a stage where clinicians can become involved in how this develops over time and to ensure that it meets their needs. FHIR, I believe, promises to revolutionise the sharing of healthcare information. FHIR is a disruptive technology, and I think we're going to see a lot of new entrants and a lot of exciting things happening in our space on the back of FHIR. So that's the end of my bit. I would like now to introduce Graham Grieve. Again, I suspect Graham is known to many of you. Graham is the FHIR project. Despite that fairly modest title, it's fair to say that FHIR is very much Graham's vision. Graham developed this in the first place, and as I say, it's fair to say he has the vision, but I think it's also fair to say that the community has taken on and has embraced that vision. I think the last thing I would say is a comment that Graham himself makes at various connectathons, is that FHIR is his fault. So Graham, over to you.
Thanks, David. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. All right. Well, let's go to the next slide then. So thanks everybody for coming, and thank you to Orion for inviting me to tell you about the FHIR community. From the beginning, FHIR has been more than a standard. It really came out of the Fresh Look project David talked about, and the question wasn't just what would a better standard look like technically, it was how do you get one? How do you write it? And so we set out to create something that was more than a standard. And what we have today is a vibrant and diverse implementation community with large vendors, small vendors, governments, countries from all around the world, consultants, open source movements. And the open source project that is FHIR, it's a hybrid standard and open source project, provides publishing tooling and it provides implementation tooling. And it's just astounding to see how diverse the implementation context. James Agnew, who writes Happy, and I were talking about this on Friday, he's got the same code running on mobile phones and running in cloud servers because it works in all those places. And also, we deliberately set out to write a new process for standards based on agile programming. What's an agile standard development look like? And that's what we built, a process built around iterative development based on connectathons. So we do sprint to sprint from connectathon to connectathon, practice what we've preached, eat our own dog food, learn from our own experiences. And that's created a standard that's developed really quickly. So if you look at the next slide, we created FHIR as a small group of us. It was under a different name, R4H, Resources for Health, in mid-2011. And from there, it sort of grew organically and quickly. We held our first Connectathon in September 2012, I think it is, and then that led to a milestone. We have our project milestones are called draft standards for trial use. We published the first one in January 2014. For a standard, that's warp speed. And then we published a second milestone in September this year, and we're going to have a working standard, which is a standard that's not draft, and yet it's not frozen either. We're still able to learn from implementation experience and respond to it, but we're also way beyond having a draft standard. There's lots of systems in production today, and actually there's a list of them on the next slide. If you look at this list of systems that are in production, Commonweal is a vendor consortium in the US. They have a patient manager, a sort of a private portal for their institutional customers that allows them to match patients and exchange patient data, and that is mediated through a FHIR interface. The Ebola response, we're very proud to be involved in the Ebola response project. Some of their internal interoperability uses FHIR. The Lithuanian National Project is going live this month, the National EHR, and the National EHR in Lithuania is based on FHIR. They used a fairly early version, but they're very happy users of FHIR, and it's live, and they're starting the rollout phase, and they're planning for upgrades to the full version of FHIR. This month also a Dutch regional care plan project is going live, where they're doing care planning, care coordination, and using a FHIR server to mediate the reactions between, or the interactions between the various care providers. It's around mental health care. Here in Australia, Brett Esler's been selling for a while now a commercial FHIR server that provides a single unified view of the various GP systems, and people are using that unified FHIR server to provide decision support across the multiple EHR, so multiple GP systems. We're also in the process of bringing up a national terminology server. The national terminology server has passed all its testing. It's not actually live yet, but it's got the go-ahead. And so we have a national terminology server based on FHIR. Those are some of the actual production uses of FHIR now that I know about. It's certainly running ahead of where we expected. When we laid out the project plan, we didn't expect to have national production systems or inter-vendor systems at this stage. We thought it would take longer to get here, and it's been astonishing for us how keen people have been to make use of the standard, even while we're still in a developing mode, simply because they believe that it's better than the alternatives. And there's certainly, beyond these production uses, there's a huge lot of use. If you look at the next slide, there's Project Argonaut and the Health Care Services Platform Coalition, which are both US-focused projects focused on creating real, tested and proven interoperable specifications and solutions for the US market. In addition to that, there's Meaningful Use 3 related ONC development work, which is a fair bit of work. IHE has quite an investment in developing fire profiles. There's projects in the lead towards production in the UK around care plans and renal health data clinical repositories. In Australia here, NEATS having a good look at fire, and you'll see some visible signs of that in the near future. And New Zealand, the National IT Health Board, has endorsed fire as a future option. And for a lot of national programs, you know, they work on very long development cycles. They'll pick an approach, and they're kind of bound to that for a decade or more. And so we're engaging heavily with some national programs because that suits their life cycle, whereas other national programs we'll be engaging with them later. That's driven by a life cycle for their life cycles. But if we consider fire's life cycle, look at the next slide. This is a fairly well-known graph. This next slide is the Gartner hype curve. On the right side, we see the Gartner's classic hype curve for a technology. There's the trigger. There's inflated expectations around what it can achieve. Then there's a trough of disillusionment when people don't realize what it is, or realize it's not going to achieve everything they hoped, followed by sensible adoption leading toward a plateau of productivity. As a project lead in fire, I often get people asking me, where are you in this curve? Well, I've got no idea, because you only find out retrospectively, but we don't see any evidence yet that the inflated expectations are slowing down. So we're not at the peak yet, we believe. And where will the trough come from? The trough will come from the fact that fire is an IT solution, and if we could solve perfectly all the IT problems with interoperability, but at the end of the day, people have to agree about what it is they're doing and how they're doing it, and that is where the trough will come from. There's no magic bullet. People still have to agree, and there'll still always be a role for interface vendors like Orion. So David, back to you.
Graham, thank you very much for that. I most appreciate your coming along. I appreciate how busy you are, and you've only just returned from the Netherlands, I believe. I'd now like to introduce a colleague of mine here at Orion, David Leach. David is the Senior Vice President of Intelligent Integration at Orion Health. David?
Yes, thank you, David. I'm just going to present for a few minutes. We would really like to allow a good time for some questions. Next slide. Thank you, Josh. The key point on this first slide is just to say Orion Health as a vendor, as an example vendor in the healthcare community, with a long history in the integration and interoperability aspects of healthcare, is committed to fire. You know, just as you saw from Graham, the stories from around the world, that the progress and momentum and hype that fire has, it's no different really from a vendor perspective. And as a vendor, we need our products to be ready for not only the earlier adopters around the world, but as it becomes more mainstream. So yeah, we are committed. We've embraced fire already. We've already released improvements in our products that are already in production use, actually. And I've got a couple of examples of those. And we continue to invest in fire. So it's not that what we've already built in our products is the end of our journey as a vendor, but our journey continues, and the market, our customers, will continue to see an increased focus on fire in the years ahead. Next slide. The first example of one of our products, it's one of my products actually, is our Rhapsody integration engine. This is a healthcare-specific integration engine where its role is to connect systems together and increasingly connect systems that span multiple organizations together as well. And this is the transport of data, a role as being a bridge in the middle in a hub and spoke kind of model, connecting systems that don't natively talk to each other. So in a world without fire, this type of capability is really important, and it's quite a well-known, mature part of our healthcare industry. but it's evolving. So if you think about just broadly the role of these integration and interoperability tools in a market where FHIR is being introduced, it evolves the role of these types of tools. So what the future looks like from my perspective and Orion Health as a vendor's perspective, there's still a role for the hub in the middle in this hub and spoke kind of model for tooling, evolved kind of tooling that supports a FHIR-to-FHIR integration, but also a FHIR to non-FHIR integration. David Hay earlier mentioned one of the challenges is mapping to FHIR. The world doesn't go from a world with no FHIR to suddenly have all systems with full support for FHIR. Yeah, the reality in practical terms for hospitals and other organisations is that for years to come we'll still have an environment where some systems will support FHIR and gradually introduce it, and others will not. Perhaps legacy systems that possibly may never support FHIR. So there are uses for tools such as Rhapsody that act as a bridge to connect systems that don't support FHIR to systems that do. And actually, that is already supported in Rhapsody. We released earlier this year a version of Rhapsody that has that capability in it. Next slide, please. Another example, I'll skip over this slide, please, Josh. I'll go to the next slide around open platform. It's an example, a second example of one of our other products. Open platform, you could think of as a platform to help our customers, our healthcare organisations innovate. It includes FHIR capability, and it actually embeds Rhapsody as well. But the solution overall is acquiring data inbound using Rhapsody and other tooling, but also importantly aggregating it. So in a hub and spoke kind of model I mentioned, and this idea of an innovation platform, this product allows you to aggregate your data centrally so that you can openly, at a low cost, with some flexibility and ease, can share the data through FHIR APIs, but through other means as well. So that's another example of a product. And as I said, just generally, we are committed, and there'll be continuous focus on this from Orion Health, and no doubt a long list of other healthcare vendors. Next slide, please. So to wrap up the entire session, FHIR is the next generation HL7 standard. Although it's still draft, it has a lot of momentum in the vendor community and a lot of projects around the world already, as you heard from Graham. We are confident that it will continue, and we're betting on it, if you like, in our investment in FHIR as a vendor. We can see an evolution in the interoperability and integration aspects of the industry here to support the adoption of FHIR in a world where it doesn't suddenly go to everything, where everything supports FHIR. So we are supporting our customers on that journey, and we're embracing it, and we're really positive and enthusiastic about it. So I'd like to now go to some questions, and I'll hand it over back to Josh to facilitate question time. Thank you.
Thank you, David Leach. Thank you, Graham Grieve, and thank you, Dr. Hay. We do have some questions here. You're welcome to submit your questions as well. The first question that we have is, what is the status of FHIR with regards to IHE, XDS profile and trial implementations?
I'll make a start at that. Graham may want to have a comment. IHE and the FHIR group are working very closely together. The FHIR community are working closely together. Graham, in fact, touched on that. The mobile document profile was one that was fairly early represented in FHIR, and there are specific FHIR resources, namely the document reference resource, which is designed to facilitate some of the registry aspects of XDS. Keith Boone and John Murky are two very prominent people in the IHE community who are also part of the FHIR community. Did you want to add anything else, Graham?
Oh, only that IHG have already, it's in IHG, this is called MHD, Mobile Health Documents. They already have certified some systems against an early version of this, and they're currently working on bringing it up to speed with the latest version. And for them, it's core business now.
Great. Okay, we'll move on to our second question. Our second question is, has FHIR been implemented in any Australian GP systems?
I think Graham actually spoke to that one in his presentation.
Yeah, so FHIR is not
So
actually implemented in the systems, but Brett Esler sells a product that actually wraps them and provides a FHIR server that gives you access to the data in the clinical system, the GP systems.
Great. Thanks, Graham. Another question, how does a large hospital implement FHIR?
carefully, perhaps slightly more seriously. I think the appropriate way to do it would be to start with some kind of almost like a greenfield project. So don't try and change what's already working, particularly in the V2 messaging space. I mean, as a side issue, our expectation is that although FHIR supports messaging, HL7 V2 messaging is going to be around for quite some time. So the idea is to pick a greenfield project off to the side and to start using FHIR for that and to start becoming familiar with FHIR. As part of that, they will probably want to put FHIR interfaces in front of existing systems through whatever technology, be it an integration engine or be it a RESTful interface. And that will enable them to grow and learn about FHIR, how it works, and I guess more importantly will help us. One of the things that neither Graham nor I really emphasised is how much we have, how much we want the community, how much we want people to do stuff in FHIR and then tell us what worked and then tell us what didn't work. You know, we're at the stage now, as I think both of us have said, where it's good enough to be used. We know it's not perfect. We know there's places where it could be made better. We really want people to go out there, do these trial implementations and tell us what we can do to improve. Graham, any comments?
Yeah, I'll add that most of these hospitals in the US that are investing heavily in FHIR are using FHIR as a portal for mobile applications that they provide to their staff, so they work within or without the hospital on their phones and their tablets, and those provide access to multiple systems within the hospital. And so it's a good way to start because you've always got fallback approaches until you've got proven stability and usability. And that's how most hospitals in the States are working.
Okay, thanks, Graham. Another question, what's the relationship between FHIR and HL7?
Well, the proper name of the standard is HL7 FHIR. So FHIR actually is an HL7 standard. So the relationship is therefore very close.
Great, thank you. What are the methods and challenges in drawing and pulling data from diverse systems that aren't integrated?
I might actually hand this one to my colleague David Leach, if I may, as this is really bread and butter for him and his division.
David, would you like
let me answer this from a vendor. Yes, sure. I'll answer from a vendor perspective, and then perhaps David or Graham might like to have additional comment. And so something Orion Health has done for a long time is not only that integration engine type tool, but health information exchanges, which is a regional type deployment acquiring data from lots of systems, from lots of different orgs. And it's an area that can sometimes be costly, can sometimes take a lot of human effort, and even not just the effort, but the duration to aggregate the data. So for us, I think security one of the challenges is the transportation of the data needs to be secure. And there's a few different ways to do that, and you want to do that in a way that doesn't slow you down. You also want often a flexibility to the tooling, so integration engines are a good example of tooling that is a good data acquisition tool. The flexibility meaning it supports systems that may support FHIR already, but when you're collecting data from lots of different systems, from diverse systems, there's therefore diverse protocols, diverse message formats, a lot of proprietary type of ways to aggregate the data, so flexibility is good. And then, yeah, a number of other considerations there as well. So that's a brief answer. Any other comments, David or Graham?
Well, I just pick up on something I was just going to mention, is the fact that quite often you find in diverse systems they represent the same thing in different ways, and they collect different sorts of information. So it might be about a procedure, but they're collecting different sets of data. So you've got to somehow match those two together. And then you have to think about how you actually exchange it, whether you're using a messaging paradigm, where you kind of notify another system, or using a document paradigm. So short answer is it's actually quite hard, but it can be done. And I guess slightly longer answer is that this is an area where FHIR hopefully will provide an area of standardization to make it easier. Graham, did you have anything to add?
No, I'll go off mute and then say I'll leave it at that.
Great. Okay, well, we're rapidly coming to the end of today's webinar. We've got 2 more questions before we wind up. This question is FHIR being embraced by the existing vendor community to write data back into their applications? That is true bidirectional interfacing.
I'm going to dump this one to Graham, I think, who has more exposure to the vendors. Orion certainly is. We're starting with exposing our data out, but certainly getting it back in again is on the roadmap. With regard to the other vendors, I think, Graham, you might be in a better position to comment.
Yeah, look, it's harder to write data back. It requires more policy, procedural, and access control decisions. And so pretty much people are making data available first and then worrying about reading it back. But almost anybody who wants to do anything useful starts saying, well, yeah, sure, you gave me the data, but I need to do stuff. That's the point. So it's not, it's not far behind. And for instance, Epic and Cerner in the States, their current focus is on making read access to the data available, but almost everybody, all the hospital partners who are doing applications are saying to them, but we're writing stuff back. That's what the applications are doing. So it is always first to do read, but it's not long before you have to do write.
Great, thanks, Graham. And our final question today is, can you explain more about what NETA and FHIR work is being done?
Well, the most publicly available at the moment is that NETA and the Commonwealth CIOs through the federal department are standing up a national terminology server. The national terminology server is based on Onto server, which is a CSIRO developed terminology server. That Onto server, national server, will support some private Onto server interfaces, and it will also support FHIR, and we've worked that through the implementation, the Connectathon process at HL7. We are also looking at making more mobile access available to the PCHR. That will be part of the purpose of that, is prototyping FHIR as and understanding what it means for a national program, for the Australian national program to engage, to use FHIR. We're still having debate about other aspects of that, and I'm not in a position to say anything more publicly about that.
Great, well, thank you, Graham. That brings us to the end of our presentation for today. This has been a presentation of eHealth Space. It's been brought to you by the sponsorship of Orion Health. I'd like to thank Dr. David Hay from Orion Health. I'd also like to thank Graham Grieve, FHIR Project Leader at Health Intersections, for his part of the presentation. And finally, I'd like to thank David Leach, who's Senior Vice President for Intelligent Integration at Orion Health. I'd like to remind you this presentation has been recorded and will go up on the ehealthspace.org website in the next few days. Again, thank you for participating, and goodbye.